The house was filled with a light, nervous anticipation as I arranged flowers on the kitchen table and adjusted the pillows on the couch. It had been a while since Kate visited us, and I wanted everything to be perfect for her stay. Small touches, a new tablecloth, fresh flowers, the scent of vanilla and cinnamon drifting through the rooms were my way of making her feel at home. But for some reason, her visit stirred a faint unease in me, as if something about her had changed over the past months. Memories of my wedding to David came to mind. In one of those pivotal life moments, I had noticed Kate watching us intently. Her gaze had turned cold for a brief second, as if it was painful for her to witness our happiness. Perhaps it was the jealous look of a sister realizing that she was no longer the most important woman in my life. I brushed it off at the time, thinking it was just the anxieties of a bride, but something stayed with me, lurking in the depths of my mind. Now, as I prepared our home for her arrival, I felt that same strange anxiety, as if something had been missed or hidden behind the usual joys of a family visit. Perhaps it was just nerves, I told myself over and over. My thoughts drifted from one memory to another, bringing a smile and then a slight worry. Maybe it was simply a memory of the past, of how our roles in each other's lives had shifted. But as soon as I heard the knock on the door, those thoughts vanished. I greeted Kate with a warm smile and a tight hug, as if everything were the same. She looked stunning, and she seemed genuinely happy to be back in our home, which gave me a false sense of calm. For the first few minutes of her visit, I felt like I could finally relax, fully immersing myself in our conversation as though nothing had changed. And yet, a part of me remained on alert, a slight unease that I couldn't completely ignore. Dinner had a relaxed atmosphere. Kate talked about her work, mentioned old acquaintances, and laughed about city news. She was the center of attention as always, effortlessly charming everyone around. But suddenly, the conversation shifted to marriage, and it was as if a hidden button had been pressed. I immediately felt myself tense. "It's interesting," she said, twirling her fork delicately on her plate. "How often people think their marriage is perfect. But usually something is hidden beneath that harmony, right? After all, real feelings can't be hidden." Her words were delivered with a light smile, yet there was an undertone that I picked up on instantly. I paused, watching her across the table, trying to catch her gaze, as if she was intentionally searching for my reaction. It stung me, a pang of jealousy or anxiety, I wasn't sure. I smiled, trying to mask the tension, and turned to David, hoping he'd respond. But he just nodded, seemingly lost in thought, and a slight ache settled in me. Memories from our youth surfaced unbidden. Back when David wasn't yet my husband, Kate would flirt with him openly. It had seemed harmless then. We were all young, and I chalked it up to her natural charm and her habit of being the center of attention. David and I had just started dating, and I never took it seriously. But now, those memories took on a different shade. Perhaps I hadn't seen what I should have back then. Maybe I'd turned a blind eye to her little games, dismissing them as part of her personality. But now, watching her look at David, throwing him those subtle smiles, I felt that my past naivety might have been misplaced. Those small flirts, the innocent touches, the seemingly casual glances, it no longer felt so innocent. But I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, that I didn't need to look for something sinister where there was none. Kate was my sister. She had always been on my side. Could I really distrust her? And yet, her ambiguous comments and lingering looks kept haunting me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. And though I tried to maintain a calm facade, something within me began to shift, as if a buried feeling of jealousy was awakening, breeding new suspicions. Lately, David seemed different. Before, I could feel his warmth in every touch, every look. But now there was an invisible barrier between us. He'd become distant, lost in his thoughts as if something was slipping away from him. Where he used to find any excuse to come close, to brush his hand against mine or hold my shoulder, he now kept his distance. At dinner, his silence was almost palpable. When I asked about his day, he would brush it off with a strained smile and the conversation would fizzle out. I tried to overlook it, convincing myself that it was just temporary, a bit of tiredness or his mind caught up with work. But the feeling that he was slowly pulling away grew unbearable. I remembered how, before our marriage, we could talk for hours about anything. Even after years together, we'd never been bored with each other. David had always been my support and my best friend. We were close, like two matching puzzle pieces. But now that bond seemed to have faded, no matter how much I tried to bring us back to where we were. Maybe it was just my reaction to Kate's visit, or perhaps I was too sensitive to her presence. Since she arrived, something had shifted and I couldn't ignore it. My thoughts, like persistent shadows, wouldn't let me rest. At some point, I caught myself watching them closely, their gestures, their looks, their words. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, David and Kate had always gotten along well. I told myself I had no right to feel jealous, that it was just my own worries and insecurities which had no place in our marriage. But the invisible wall between David and me grew more tangible, and I could no longer ignore the feeling. No, I told myself, trying to dismiss my doubts. It's only my imagination, just circumstances, just fatigue. Yet I promised myself I'd keep an eye on how they behaved, striving to remain objective. I couldn't allow myself to become a prisoner of my own suspicions, but I also couldn't keep turning a blind eye to what was unfolding. One warm evening, as I was about to make tea, I heard soft voices coming from the garden. David and Kate were chatting cheerfully, as if nothing else existed around them. Their laughter was light and free, like old friends who had no secrets from one another. Before, I would have felt happy to see such closeness between them, but now it made me feel like an outsider in my own life. Through the window, I saw them sitting on a bench among the flowers, leaning slightly toward each other. I hesitated to go outside as if I didn't want to interrupt their conversation, but an inner tension grew within me, as if there was something inappropriate in their laughter and ease. It looked as though they were sharing a private secret that I could neither know nor should know. Gathering my thoughts, I stepped into the garden, and they immediately fell silent, as if an invisible thread connecting their conversation had suddenly been severed. Kate looked up first and greeted me with a warm smile, while David simply nodded and smiled. But there was a shadow of something indescribable in his gaze. He immediately switched to a neutral tone as if nothing unusual was happening. They looked so relaxed, yet something about their posture, the way they sat so close, felt inappropriate to me. I noticed that my shoulders had tensed, and an unpleasant chill had settled in my stomach. I tried to convince myself again that it was just foolish worry, that it was nothing more than an ordinary interaction between sister and brother-in-law. They had always gotten along well, and there should be no room for jealousy. Perhaps my imagination was playing a cruel trick on me, turning simple gestures into an entire drama. But something lingered, and the memory of their carefree laughter and closeness haunted me the rest of the evening. An inner voice whispered that maybe I was just too sensitive, that my nerves were fraying after all these anxious weeks. I reminded myself that Kate and I had grown up together, and that she had always been on my side, and her smile had been genuine. And yet I felt a growing unease, as if these small details were forming a picture I was afraid to acknowledge. And while I tried to reassure myself that it was just nerves and fatigue, part of me knew things weren't that simple. That encounter in the garden left a heavy mark on me, one I could no longer ignore. At that moment, I couldn't have imagined that just a minute ago they had been kissing. It would have been impossible to imagine. After all, she's my sister and he's my husband. "Laura, what if I stay for a few more days?" Kate asked unexpectedly over our morning coffee. She glanced around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time and with a smile added, "I could really use a break and your house is just so cozy, like a little nest." The words caught in my throat. I hadn't anticipated that Kate might want to stay longer. On one hand, I understood she was going through a tough time, and a rest here could be good for her. On the other hand, the thought of her staying longer stirred mixed feelings in me that I couldn't quite explain. Although she was asking me for permission, her gaze was directed at David, as if his reaction was the deciding factor. "Of course, stay as long as you need," I managed, trying to smile. "We're always happy to have you." Kate smiled back at me, but her eyes quickly returned to David, as though my response was just a formality. David nodded, smiling back at her with friendly calm. They exchanged a look, and in that moment I felt a sharp pang deep inside. During lunch, when the conversation shifted to funny incidents at work, Kate became animated. She shared a story about a client who'd asked for the fanciest coffee machine and then couldn't figure out how to use it. With all those buttons, it could practically be a new exhibit at the Modern Art Museum, David laughed. And I saw how Kate, laughing, lightly touched his hand. She glanced at him with warmth and amusement, as if it was just natural. "You know, David, you're quite the master of sarcasm," she winked. "If we ever opened a coffee shop, we could call it Cup of Sarcasm." He chuckled, shaking his head. I tried to keep a smile, though a heaviness settled inside me. Those little gestures, fleeting touches, glances. All of it should have seemed harmless, but in that moment they felt too significant. It was as if she knew exactly how to make him laugh, like she was playing a tune that used to be meant for me. I kept convincing myself that it was just my exhaustion and strained nerves. All of this was nothing more than coincidences, little moments that I was blowing out of proportion. They'd always gotten along well, so what was strange about that? But watching Kate as she threw her head back in laughter and continued to touch David lightly, naturally, I couldn't shake the feeling that this casual closeness was becoming too personal. I tried to brush off this wave of jealousy that suddenly crashed over me. Yes, it could have been justified by my anxieties and stress, and yet, it wouldn't let go. I tried to justify myself, thinking that jealousy was just a side effect of my worries and the tension of the past few weeks. But at the same time, deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. Jealousy wasn't a pleasant feeling, but it betrayed what I could no longer ignore. When I walked into our bedroom, something caught my eye on the bedside table. I moved closer and saw Kate's earrings, thin silver hoops she wore almost daily. Why were they here? David and I always tried to keep our room just for us, and the thought of Kate leaving her things here gave me an odd feeling, as if someone had crossed the boundary of our personal space. Frowning slightly, I went to find my sister. She was in the kitchen, peacefully flipping through a magazine and sipping coffee as if nothing had happened. I tried to keep my voice calm, though a hint of irritation slipped in. "Kate, did you by any chance leave your earrings in our room?" I asked, holding up the hoops. She looked up, and to my surprise, her gaze held no embarrassment. She simply shrugged as if it was completely normal. "Oh yeah, I probably did," she said, nodding casually. "I remember airing out your room when you weren't home, and I guess I forgot them there. Nothing serious, I just wanted the air to be fresh in there." Her explanation sounded so casual, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why did she need to be in our bedroom when I wasn't around? And if the earrings were indeed left there by accident, what if they were just the tip of the iceberg? I tried to dismiss these thoughts, but they lingered like persistent shadows. Memories of our childhood surfaced. Kate had always been the one who wanted to be better, always craving attention, seeking approval. She was brighter, more confident, as if she truly believed she had to be the better one in everything. I recalled moments when she would win over my friends, becoming the center of attention in places where it seemed I should have been. Now, this memory of her relentless need to be first made me wonder, could she be trying to take a place I thought was mine even now? Why did she need to go into our bedroom even to air it out? Maybe I should just let go of these thoughts and not assign too much significance to random details. But the growing unease was getting harder to ignore. I felt as if an invisible wall was forming between David and me, and my relationship with Kate was slowly filling with tension and doubt. Thoughts about trust, about the idea that my own sister could intrude into my life this way, were eroding my confidence in the familiar. And the more I tried to convince myself it was all just coincidences, the more these feelings clouded my perception of the people closest to me. With each passing day, I felt more and more like David and Kate were acting like accomplices, hiding something from me. They were having private conversations more often, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the garden, their laughter drifting from different corners of the house like a quiet melody I wasn't a part of. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home, as if I were an uninvited guest at a celebration. One evening just before bed, when I was finally alone with David, he asked unexpectedly, "So, how long is Kate staying with us?" I was surprised by his question. Just curiosity, perhaps, but there was a faint shadow of displeasure in his tone. I replied calmly, "A few more days. She mentioned she needed some rest." David paused, and a hint of disappointment flickered on his face. It cut me to the core. Why was he unhappy that my sister was staying with us? He was always the one who welcomed her warmly, who always made time and space for her in our lives. But now that she was here, I sensed that something had shifted between them. Trying to brush aside the strange thoughts, I moved closer to him and kissed him. I hoped for a response, for him to hold me and rekindle the closeness I was so desperately seeking. But David sighed and, pulling back slightly, whispered, "Sorry, honey. I'm too tired tonight." After saying this, he turned away, and within minutes he was fast asleep. I lay there beside him, feeling lonelier than ever, as if a gulf separated us rather than a bed. My eyes stung with tears, and I couldn't understand what was happening. Why had things been so different before? Why now, when I needed his affection most, did he seem so distant? Could this really just be exhaustion? The next day, as I passed by the living room, I accidentally overheard them talking. David and Kate were whispering about something, and soon their laughter followed. I stopped, unable to move. Their laughter sounded so warm, so genuine, as if I were once again the outsider. Something inside me tore, and I felt myself being enveloped in a wave of loneliness and detachment. I couldn't walk in and tell them how much it hurt. I couldn't reveal that their laughter brought me such sharp pain that I wanted to run far away. It was as if an invisible barrier had formed between us, and I was forced to watch as my husband and my sister shared something that had once belonged to me. An inner voice whispered that if my suspicions were true, this would be the greatest betrayal of my life. That feeling of betrayal grew inside me like a storm ready to break, but I continued trying to convince myself it was just my imagination born of exhaustion and nerves. But I could no longer deny it. If this turned out to be true, I wasn't sure I could ever forgive them. I knew that silence only amplified my anxiety. I realized that if I didn't talk to David now, these doubts and suspicions would consume me completely. When he returned from work that evening, I decided it was the right moment. We sat in the kitchen. He relaxed with a cup of tea, and I carefully began. "David, I need to talk to you." He looked at me with mild surprise, but quickly returned his gaze to his teacup, as if he already knew it would be a difficult conversation and was preemptively searching for a way to evade it. "Sure, what's up?" he asked, but his voice was tense, as though he knew what I was about to say and didn't want to hear it. "Lately, you've been distant," I said, choosing my words as carefully as possible. "I feel like there's a gap between us, and it hurts. You seem like you're somewhere else." David waved off my words with a faint smile, as if they were just another complaint. "Laura, it's just work. I'm exhausted, that's all," he replied shortly, quickly steering the conversation in another direction, as if he didn't want to go any deeper. His reaction left me disappointed. I tried to share my feelings, but he brushed them off as if they were insignificant. My anxiety only grew, and with each evasive response, it became harder to believe it was truly just work. Left alone after our brief conversation, I began to remember our early years together. How happy we were when we first married. Every day felt magical. Every little thing brought us joy. I believed that our love was strong enough to withstand anything. Back then, I saw David as my dependable friend, my partner who would never betray me. We shared everything with each other, always sincere and open. How quickly it had all changed, as if someone had turned a page, and now I was facing a different person. I sat there trying to convince myself that David was simply tired, that these were just temporary difficulties we needed to get through. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt that my attempts to reassure myself weren't bringing any relief. Jealousy, like a shadow, lurked in my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. Now, every word he said, every look he gave me seemed filled with hidden meaning. When he looked at me, I wondered if he was thinking of someone else, of her. When he talked about work, I found myself suspecting him of lying. It was a painful battle with myself, to not believe my own fears, to not see what hurt. But I felt increasingly cornered, and my doubts, like rust, corroded everything I once believed to be unbreakable. I tried to remind myself that these were just my fears, that I was simply exhausted and in need of rest, that everything could be fixed if only I calmed down and stopped seeing enemies where there were none. But despite my attempts, an inner fire of unease continued to burn. And that fire, it didn't let me rest, reminding me that something was wrong, that I still hadn't found the answers I was looking for. The last few days at home had been tense. Kate increasingly cast subtle, knowing glances at me, as if she held some secret knowledge I was unaware of. These looks carried a hidden message, as though she was quietly laughing at my confusion and ignorance. It was becoming harder and harder to ignore the feeling that something significant was happening in my life, from which I'd been deliberately excluded. One morning, as I entered the bedroom to make the bed, a strange feeling washed over me. Lying casually on the bedspread was a piece of lace lingerie that unmistakably belonged to Kate. I recognized it instantly. I'd seen it among her belongings before. A chill ran down my spine. Why were her personal items on our bed? I picked it up, trying to keep my composure, and made my way to Kate, who was calmly sipping her tea in the kitchen as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Trying to keep my emotions in check, I held out the lingerie to her. "Kate, is this yours?" I asked, trying to keep my tone as calm as possible, though inside I felt a knot tightening. Kate looked at me and strangely showed no embarrassment or surprise. She took the lingerie, smiling as if it were just an innocent accident. "Oh yes, sorry, Laura," she replied with a light smile. "I must have mixed it up while sorting the laundry and accidentally put it with your things. You know how it is, especially when you're rushing. I didn't even notice I'd misplaced it." Her explanation sounded plausible, but a seed of doubt had already been planted. Yes, such things happen. Maybe it really was just an innocent mistake, and yet, I now viewed every detail, every glance as a possible clue. Something in me sensed that there was more to this incident than met the eye. I promised myself that if I found even one more piece of evidence, any slight confirmation of my suspicions, I wouldn't stay silent. My patience was running thin, and if my suspicions were true, I'd be facing what would be the most painful betrayal of my life. Now I noticed every gesture, every look, every moment when their conversations turned to whispers. The storm inside me was growing, and I knew. Soon I would uncover the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. That day I decided to leave work early. Kate was set to leave the next day, and I wanted to prepare a farewell dinner for her, a warm family evening to show her that despite all my worries, I valued her and wanted everything to end on a good note. It was my way of regaining confidence, of believing that perhaps all my suspicions were just the product of an exhausted mind. I had chosen her favorite dishes for dinner, bought fresh flowers, and was looking forward to the moment when we'd all sit together at the table. But as soon as I approached the house, a strange feeling swept over me. The silence outside only made the soft voices coming from the bedroom window more pronounced. I recognized David's voice, and Kate's. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe they were just talking about something important, preparing for her departure, and I was worrying needlessly once again. However, as I climbed the stairs, all the doubts and fears that had been building up over the past weeks transformed into one piercing sensation. I moved up each step slowly, as if each one were covered in broken glass. Fragments of thoughts flashed through my mind. My anxiety grew, but there was still a sliver of hope that this was just my imagination. Deep down, I prayed that when I opened the door, I would find something harmless, something that would prove all my suspicions were wrong. But as I opened the door, I saw something that I could neither explain nor forgive. David and Kate were lying under the covers, wrapped in each other's arms, their faces alight with the same warmth and closeness that I used to see in David's eyes when we had first started dating. Laughing and whispering, they didn't even notice I had entered the room. From the way they held each other, it was clear that this intimacy hadn't been limited to a conversation before I arrived home. Their expressions and the way their bodies were intertwined spoke volumes, telling a story that shattered me in an instant. The world I knew was crumbling right in front of me, as if someone had ruthlessly torn it to pieces. I felt something break deep inside, as if the very foundation of my life, trust, love, security, had been stolen from me. I froze, unable to speak, unable to look away from them, struggling to accept that this was reality and not some nightmare. In that moment, I realized that my greatest fear had become true. There was no way to close my eyes to what I had seen. My worst suspicions were confirmed, and with that, a part of me was gone forever. Reflexively shutting the bedroom door, I tried to block out the image I had just seen. My heart tightened and my eyes filled with tears as I rushed to the closet, grabbing a suitcase and frantically throwing clothes into it. Emotions overwhelmed me, drowning out every other sound around me. David followed me, his voice desperate as he tried to explain. "Laura, please, it's not what you think. You've just been so suspicious lately, always looking for something that isn't there." I felt pushed away, misunderstood. His words echoed in the background, but I didn't respond. I couldn't hear him over the roar of betrayal in my mind, over the pain that had settled deep in my heart. His attempts to shift the blame onto me only deepened the wound. As I continued packing, I noticed Kate entering the room. Her expression flickered between guilt and self-defense. She held up her hands almost as if to calm me. "Laura, listen. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was just feeling lost. I didn't mean to hurt you. We both made mistakes." Her words, detached and almost indifferent, struck me with a surge of bitter anger. There was no remorse in her voice, no recognition of the damage she had done. Instead, she seemed to be downplaying everything, brushing it off as a mere lapse, a simple mistake. I stopped packing for a moment, looking at her, my tears now turning into a cold, resolute anger. "Mistakes," I repeated, feeling the word ring hollow. "Is that what you call betraying your own sister? A mistake?" Her gaze faltered, but she offered no apology, no attempt to understand the depth of the pain she had caused. This wasn't the sister I thought I knew. This was someone else, a stranger who had shattered the trust I had once held sacred. In that moment, I realized I could never forgive them. Their betrayal had been too powerful a blow, severing not only my bond with David but the very foundation of my relationship with Kate. This wasn't something that could be justified, explained, or rationalized. They had both crossed a line that left no way back. Taking a deep breath, I closed the suitcase, feeling a weight lift as I resolved to leave them in the past. Whatever love, trust, or loyalty I had once felt for them was gone. They had both chosen to betray me, and there was no longer any place for them in my life. As I packed the last of my things, a sense of determination rose within me. This wasn't just packing, it was preparation for a new beginning, a life with no place for pain, betrayal, or deceit. Everything that had happened here would stay in this house, in these rooms, and would no longer be a part of my life. David stood by the door, his eyes full of desperation, a look that once might have made me reconsider. But now it didn't matter. He reached out to take my hand, but I pulled away. "Laura, please don't leave," he said quietly, almost pleadingly. "I know I made a mistake. It was a moment of weakness. But I love you. Please don't leave me." I stopped for a second, looking at him, but in that moment, I realized there was nothing left to say. Any words that could have saved us had been lost long ago, even before I walked into that bedroom and saw them together. Words could no longer mend what had been destroyed. "No, David. You made your choice," I said softly, keeping my voice steady. "You and Kate, both of you. There's no fixing this." With those words, I walked to the door, feeling a growing sense of clarity with each step. As I closed the door behind me, the weight of betrayal that had hung over me for so long finally lifted. I felt hollow inside, but this emptiness was lighter than the pain that had consumed me over the past few weeks. I walked down the steps, heading toward my car, and realized that I was ready to start a new life. By leaving them behind, I had freed myself. Ahead lay a new path, a new chapter where I could finally find peace and rebuild my life on my own terms. Starting the car, I drove toward my parents' house, determined to tell them everything. My parents deserved to know the lengths their daughter had gone to, betraying her own sister. I could no longer keep silent, and if they chose to distance themselves from Kate afterward, then so be it. Let this be her punishment, her reckoning for betraying her family. After leaving David and Kate, I found temporary refuge at my parents' house. Their home, once familiar and safe, now felt strange, as if I had returned to a place where I could no longer be the same person. But my parents welcomed me with love and understanding. supporting me through this difficult time. My mother, without asking too many questions, held me as she did when I was a child, back when everything seemed so simple. Their support helped me stay afloat. The nights were the hardest. In the silence, thoughts would come. Memories would return suddenly and mercilessly. But over time, I began to find not only pain in those memories, but also resolve. I realized that the life I had once lived was gone forever, and that now I could build something new, something just for me. These thoughts kept me going. I started to envision my future, thinking about who I wanted to become, who I needed to be so I would never again be vulnerable to betrayal by others. I wanted to become strong, independent, someone who could trust herself and her feelings. I promised myself I would work on my self-confidence. No one would ever again manipulate my emotions. I didn't need those who could so easily betray my trust. Now I understood that my life was in my own hands, and I would decide who was worthy of being in it and who was not. This difficult time had given me the chance to start over, and I was determined never to let anyone destroy my peace and my world again. A new day arrived, and with it came the realization that I was truly free. The past, once so essential and unshakable, was now left behind, along with those who had once meant everything to me. I had completely cut all ties with David and Kate, and I knew now that this decision was the right one. I had drawn valuable conclusions from this experience. I would never again let my feelings take a back seat. I understood now how important it was to trust my instincts. They had tried to warn me more than once. It was a bitter lesson, but it was for the best that it happened now, while I was still young and had the time to live the life I truly deserved. Better to know now than to discover decades later that I had been with the wrong person all along. My thoughts drifted to the past, but without pain. I looked at it now with gratitude for the lessons it had taught me. I no longer felt anger or resentment. Instead, there was a sense of calm, as if I had finally been freed from a burden I had carried for too long. The past no longer had any power over me. Looking forward, I saw only possibilities. My new life awaited me, full of freedom, discoveries, and opportunities. I felt ready to take the first step, to become someone who lives in harmony with herself, building her life on her own terms. I knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but I now had the confidence to face any challenge that came my way. Taking a deep breath, I stepped toward the new chapter of my life, filled with determination and self-belief. This path was mine alone, and I embraced it gladly, knowing that no one could shatter my world again.